the global oil market may be heading for a major shakeup. According to Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, prices could drop to $40-50 a barrel by the end of 2025. The reasons? Cracks in the OPEC Plus deal, Saudi Arabia pumping more oil, rising U.S. shale production, slower growth in China and new supply from Brazil, Guyana, Norway. For Russia, oil remains the main source of funding for its war in Ukraine. If that flow of money can be stopped, the war effort could be crippled. But can the world really do it? Joining me now, Dr. Thomas O'Donnell. He is an American energy and geopolitics strategist based in Berlin. Mr. O'Donnell, it's a pleasure to have you here in our studio.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be on speaking to the Ukrainian people.
Thank you. So, you written and also you were saying in your podcast that the only effective way to stop Russia funding its war is to block its oil exports. Is that actually possible? And what would it take? How long would it take?
Well, that's a key question. So just a little bit of history. If you recall, when the full-scale invasion began in 2022, the first instinct in the European Union was to try to simply, old-fashioned sanctions on Russian oil, to simply block it. However, the United States and the Biden administration intervened very strongly and did a lot of diplomatic work to convince people that we shouldn't do that. It would be too disruptive to the international market to take Russia offline. Russia is one of the three, I would say, superpower producers of oil. The United States is far ahead right now, but also Saudi Arabia and Russia are about at the same level. And those three are way ahead of everybody else, double or triple everybody else, each one of them. So in normal times, it might have been, oh, wow, if you took Russia offline, if it was possible, it might be a tremendous crisis in the international market. However, I argued very strongly at the time, and some of my colleagues, that this was wrong. The market conditions were such, coming out of Corona and some other details I could tell you about, that you could stepwise take Russian oil off the market, that there was sufficient spare capacity out there, either already developed capacity that could be brought online, or other fields that have been discovered and not yet brought online. And the head of the International Energy Agency, he's still the head, Fatih Birol, at the time repeatedly said, if Russia has to be replaced, there's enough oil in the world. So I think it could have been done back then. And starting a couple of years ago, I started giving talks to officials and then later publicly that there's a way this can be done. And what the Trump administration is doing, to me, is very similar to sort of what I had proposed, a bit different with these tariffs. But yes, this is the biggest economic hit you could give to Russia. Whether that would force them to end the war or not, it's not clear, but it would certainly make it very difficult for them to continue the war. And it can be done.
Okay, yes, but why is that happening right now? I'm just opening the website and see that the biggest wartime buyers of Russian fossil fuels, but speaking about oil, why is the leaders who's buying Russian oil right now in European Union? Hungary, not surprised. Belgium, partially, I think. Slovakia and also France. Why is that happening, still happening in Europe?
Well, just to be clear, it's wrong that they're doing that, and that does help Putin's war effort. But even if we stop that, that's not fundamental. Fundamental is to stop Russia from exporting oil. And if I could just explain, you asked me earlier, is it possible to do this? As you know, under this oil price cap, they're allowed to export their oil. It's just that they have to only charge a certain amount. And that just hasn't worked. They're sending tremendous amount of oil to China and India, and they're making sufficient money to continue the war. Okay, so it has to be taken offline. Russia has three primary ports it exports from on the westward. One is Primorsk, Ost-Lunga, and Novorossiya in the Black Sea. And then there's another major one on the eastern side of Russia. These three ports, if they stopped exporting oil, this would be well over 3 million barrels a day, 3.5 million barrels a day at least of Russian oil. Now, there's various ways. If that was sanctioned, what the United States can do is they have to put secondary sanctions on India and China, the two primary buyers. And Trump is doing this with this idea of secondary tariffs, which seems could be fairly effective. If you see what he's focused on India first. And India, of course, Modi is very publicly very resistant, very truculent. Oh, no, I won't give in to you. I'm a friend, sort of a longtime friend of Russia in a certain way. But meanwhile, I look in the industry journals, and within a day or two, the main importers of oil in India had already booked 22 million barrels of non-Russian oil. So this can have a stark effect and probably cut off the oil that India is able to take if Trump pursues it. And then he has to decide whether he's going to pursue that with China. Now, this tells me Putin understands that this is a disaster. If he can't export this oil, this will kill his budget. And it's interesting that he immediately says, oh, I want to meet you in Alaska. I want to talk. Whether he's serious or not, I don't know. But he understands that this can be existential for his country. The Secretary of Interior in the United States, Mr. Bergram, he's been talking rather quietly. You might not have seen it in the press much, but for a long time, he says, if we take Russia offline, we should take them off permanently. Now, it's not just bluster. Russia is very vulnerable. They have no place to store their oil if they keep pumping it and they can't export it from these 3 or 4 ports. What do? They can't dump it on the ground for very long. And the problem is the West Urals, where it comes from, these are very old fields. And if you slow them down too much or stop them, you're basically not going to get them going again without very advanced technology and hundreds of millions of dollars spent. So essentially, it would ruin the Russian oil sector basically forever, for a very long period of time, especially if it happened in winter. Those fields would wax up. So it's realistic, very realistic, that the United States can ruin the Russian oil sector. And we could talk about this more. There is plenty of oil available that could be brought online stepwise. And I think the United States has been preparing to do this for a number of months quietly to replace that oil.
Yeah, but if they will do that, what's going to happen in the oil market in general after that?
You mean if the Russian oil was not replaced?
Replaced, yes.
Yeah, well, if it wasn't replaced, the price would spike. We'd have a huge, would cause economic. But the point is, it's perfectly possible to replace it. Now, if you look at what Trump has done, when he came in office, of course, he had this idea. He wants to make peace in Ukraine, fine, but he wants to do it in a way that pulls Putin away from China. So he insisted on talking and talking, I think, longer than any reasonable person would have. But now he realizes that Putin hasn't been serious. So now, if we look back, even in January when he was inaugurated, his cabinet was talking about a plan B all along. And the plan B would be A, give Ukraine basically any weapons they need, and there is some plan like that now that the Europeans pay for. But the other part of plan B was to kill the Russian oil exports and ruin their economy. And I interpret, for example, when Trump went to the Middle East, to the Gulf states, he had this sort of love fest meeting with the Qataris, with the UAE, and with the Saudis, the last two being very big oil producers. And it was about that time that the Saudis, since the beginning of the year, but especially since that time, have insisted that OPEC pump more oil, put their oil back on the market that they had held off. Now, it didn't seem to make any sense because it's driving the price down. So why would they be doing this? People said, oh, to take market share. But to me, what makes sense is they understand that the Americans are preparing to take Russia offline. And hey, for the Saudis, this is business. In the UAE, it's business. We'll take their market share. In the past, when Obama did this, for example, when he wanted to take Iran offline, the Chinese complained very loudly, sort of like Modi is. But what the Americans did is they talked to the king. They made sure that he had the UAE produce new oil. And in fact, so much oil, when it got to the level of new oil they were putting on the market rapidly that equaled the amount China was getting from Iran, China flipped its vote at the UN and supported sanctions. So my guess is the United States has been behind the scenes working to do things like this. to see that the Saudis, the UAE, and others, its own shale producers also, will have plenty of oil out there. There may even be deals to try and take care of India and China.
Yeah, you know, Mr. O'Donnell, I was thinking why the US still has sanctioned India but not China, and I was thinking what other methods of pressure can be imposed on Beijing. I don't know. If not sanctions, then what else? Well, that's
well, one could interpret it different ways. Okay, if you want to completely not trust Trump, then say he's Mr. Taco, another one he gives up on. He's not going to go after China. He'll go after the weaker one, India. Now, I don't know. Another way to look at it is you've got India and China. You don't jump on them both at the same time. India is most vulnerable, and you can see the effect, as I mentioned earlier. It's already having effect. They're already looking for alternative oil. No matter what they say, they're very vulnerable. Now, China, historically, when Americans have even under this price cap thing, when they've said, we're going to put secondary sanctions on banks or any refineries that finance oil banks that finance oil for refineries, that's Russian oil, that's above the price cap, the Chinese immediately backed off. They want to use the dollar in the world, their companies. They immediately backed off and quickly found other banks and tried to find ways around it. So China could be quite vulnerable, and I don't know, but there's these negotiations going on with China, and there's a deadline of several days, and it may be that when that deadline comes up, that's when Trump will do this with China. But let me just say, if the idea here was to force Putin to negotiate and more seriously negotiate, he's got it for right now. And I think Trump might sit back for a little while and say, okay, let's see what Putin says. And if it's not adequate, then I would assume after he goes after India, he has to go after China. And the United States, if they want to do this, and all the signals I've seen is they're preparing for a long time systematically, they can do this. It would be quite a conflict, but they can do this. And that would make it very difficult for Russia to continue after several months of not being able to pump this oil. But we can't say for sure, but based on things that have happened before when severe sanctions are put on Iran or other countries and relationships, this all sort of smells familiar to me.
But if the American president will impose sanctions against China, don't you think he will push India closer to China? We will see a strong global south against the United States?
Well, that's what they've been threatening, okay? Yeah. Obviously. And truth be told, like I said, talk is one thing. Look at where they're buying their oil. So Modi is making a big deal. He doesn't want to completely cut off with Russia. But, even on arms, he seems beholden to Russia on arms. For a number of years now, the Chinese have been moving away from Russian arms because the Russians have difficulty providing them. They have great difficulty with quality control. And so India was already moving that way. And India had problems with China because of border conflicts and so forth. They had, real problems. So, to me, it's quite interesting that the American president is willing to take the chance that, India might go with China or might break with the United States in order to force Putin to the peace table. What more can you ask in a certain sense? I can't guarantee what will happen in the future, but he's doing what has to be done with this pressure on India. And I think India is very vulnerable. The United States is their main market for exports. If they continue buying Russian oil and the Americans continue with this, I think they're going to have to give in. And then you have to move on to China.
Yes, because India was not buying Russian oil until 2022, to be honest, right?
Very little, a small amount.
Yeah.
But now, if you talk about West Urals oil, the oil that mainly goes out to Western ports, they're taking about 80% of that. But India and China together, if you take all the Russian oil, there's Russian oil from other places besides the West Urals. In total, India and China are taking 90% of what Putin exports. Now, it's actually kind of interesting. People, why India and China? That's only two targets we have to go at then. And I think it's been clear for a long time, Putin could have just as well spread this oil out in 40, 50 countries. But by going with India and China, what's he looking for? He's looking for votes in the UN. He's looking for big allies that can stand with him. He's not looking for a lot of small, Asian countries or countries that are, more close to the United States who won't do this reliably. So this is a big stakes geopolitical game on both sides.
Yeah, but what role could central bank play if there is a serious blockade of Russian oil could happen?
No, yes. I mean, if Trump puts these very high sanctions on India, as he said, it's a certain amount of days before they take effect. This is devastating for Indian industry. And he's shown a willingness to do similar things with China, but they're in a back and forth negotiation. And this is another thing he's going to throw into the mix. So I can't guarantee what he's going to do, but I know that there's plenty of other oil out there. It would be different if India and China didn't have any choice. There's plenty of oil. Tomorrow they could decide taking oil from a number of other countries and completely replace China. Okay? And the reason they're doing this might be partially geopolitical, of course, but it's also they're making a lot of money. India they buy this oil very cheaply and resell it in the world and make a good profit. And plus they're making at home a profit, and the Chinese the same thing. The Chinese are happy. Any country ever gets in trouble, an oil exporting country, where they're not competitive in the market, and everyone says, oh, they're going to have to close down. They're not. The Chinese come in and said, hey, we'll buy your oil at a discount, and they use it to fill up their reserves. It's part of their preparations for war and so forth. So there's plenty of other oil out there. I think it doesn't take too much pain imposed on India and China to say there's plenty of other oil at a reasonable price. Okay, I give up this advantage I've had lately of getting it cheaper from Russia. But the truth of the matter is Russia's been raising the price to them closer to what the market price is. And India has gained, it was estimated, I think by Bloomberg, I think it was $4.5 billion in the last year or 2 years, $4.5 billion dollars saved by buying Russian oil cheap. But they export something like 35 billion, 35.5 or so billion a year to the United States. So do the math. If the United States is really going to clamp down on those imports, and there's plenty of other oil out there, that's not worth $3.5 billion, I should say.
Mr. Donalbaum, who has the lowest price? Russia on the market?
Well, put it this way. Well, the way it works now is there's really one global barrel. There's one global price. It's either the West Texas price or the Brent price in Europe. And if your oil's a little better than that oil or a little worse, the price is a little higher or lower. Yeah. Now, what Putin has been forced to do is sell his oil cheaper because it's a geopolitical risk. If you take it, you could get sanctions. And also, it's more expensive for him to sell the oil because he has to use these ersatz tankers. He has to use the shadow fleet, and it costs more money. He has to go longer routes. And yes, it costs him more money, and he sells it at a discount. And that's what makes it attractive to India and China, and also Turkey to some degree. However, they're not making that much of a profit by buying it from Putin, compared to the geopolitical and economic and financial difficulties the United States could cause for both countries, because in both cases, they're the big market for those countries. So if you see my point. So Russia is selling it at a discount. The discount isn't as low as it used to be. West Ural's oil was never worth as much as Brent. It's a little heavier, more sulfur. So it's always was sold a little bit cheaper because it's not as good a quality, maybe $10 below the Brent price, the standard price that's set in Europe. And lately he's been selling it below that. But the price of Brent has come down so much that there's not much difference. He's trying to bring it up close. So they're not gaining that much by buying Russian oil. And they've got to do a calculation. How does that compare to the grief that Mr. Trump can give them?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, now it makes more sense. And you actually, when I opened one of your latest article, it says oil war. So, Mr. O'Donnell, from your perspective, can we say that we are at the beginning or in the process, in the middle of full-scale oil trade war?
Well, it began. The United States took the first steps.
Yes.
Just to be clear, fair is fair. Putin launched an oil war in 2020. Most people don't know about it. It was going to be a 5-year-long war. Mr. Sechin advised, there's a letter that became public where he advised Putin to launch this war. He said COVID was coming. The Saudis had led OPEC to decide to lower the price of take lots of oil off market so the price wouldn't completely collapse. And the Russians came in and said, we're not going to take oil off the market. We're going to dump oil on the market. We're going to ruin the price of oil because we have $600 billion in the bank in Russia in the reserves. We can last 5 years. And in 5 years, we'll drive American shale oil out of business. That was his theory he presented to Putin in this letter. And American shale will go bankrupt because they can't go as low as we can go in price. And then they won't be able to sanction us anymore. This was Sechin's plan presented to Putin to kill the American ability to create sanctions on Russia for the 2014 invasion. What happened? Within 2 or 3 days, they lost. The Saudis, they didn't understand how this works. First of all, even if Americans shale went bankrupt, what would happen? All the technology, all the skill would still be there. Somebody else would come in and take the company without debt, and they'd produce it even cheaper. It just didn't make any sense. But on the other, it was a bad plan. But on the other hand, they did not understand what the Saudis can do. This also hurt the Saudis. They didn't want the price to crash for 5 years. They dumped so much oil really cheap in Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europe, within a day or two, that the price of Russian Urals crude went negative. Putin immediately called the prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and said, please, I want a truce. My oil war is over. The prince wouldn't answer the phone. He wouldn't talk to him. So he had to call Trump and ask Trump to intervene, and they made a deal. And that's why the Russians were forced to join OPEC Plus and go up and down with their production as the Saudis led OPEC Plus up and down, and they've been stuck there ever since. So they tried an oil war in 2020, and they were smashed. One of the not CEO, but the second in command of one of the biggest Russian private companies said, "What does this mean for Russia?" He said it's an embarrassment. They said, "What do you mean?" He said, "It's like the Brest-Litovsk fiasco once again." And I think your listeners know what Brest-Litovsk was, right? That's when Russia lost Ukraine in World War I. He said, this is as bad as that. So now the Americans are launching an oil war against Putin. But right now there's a truce because Putin says he's going to come and talk seriously. So let's see. If he doesn't talk seriously, the war is on again. And,
Yeah. Actually, Mr. O'Donnell, you were just at the beginning. You said about the meeting that's going to happen this Friday in Alaska. What do you think about that meeting? Do you think it's going to be exceptional about Ukraine and peace deal, or something else like economic? And maybe they're going to discuss something more than just a peace in Ukraine.
Well, I think it's complicated for Ukraine.
Yeah.
It seems to be that a certain good level of trust has been developed between your president, Mr. Zelensky, and the president of the U.S., Trump. He sort of understands what Trump wants to force Putin into negotiations. Now, the thing about what Trump has said for a long time, he doesn't talk about this so much anymore, but I believe this is still central to his strategy. It was central to his strategy the first time he was elected, but he didn't have any way of pursuing it very long, and he gave it up. But he repeated it when he came back in office. And what that is, he wants to force an end to the war in Ukraine, but in some way that's acceptable to Europe and to the Ukrainians, it might not be very pretty, put it that way. It might be painful, but in some way that could be taken. But he wants to do it in such a way that he pulls Putin away from China and towards the West. He's gotten a lot of criticism for this, but and rightly so. Former American presidents, Obama, Bush, each one had various plans to try and pull Russia in some way away from China, which makes perfect strategic sense. If China's a peer competitor to the United States and the United States is very worried about a war with China, it's better you pull Russia away from China because that would be very dangerous. But most people thought that, one president after the other has tried this and they failed. That ship has sailed. It's not possible. But I think that's part of what Trump is still doing. So he's put Putin in a very difficult position right now, both with new weapons to Ukraine paid for by the Europeans and with this oil war I'm describing. So Putin wants to talk, but he wants to do it in a way that he'll say, look, if you end this war, basically Trump's attitude is, I'm not going to make your life miserable. Where you can have investments in Russia, you can have your gas market back in Europe, just move away from the Chinese, move closer to us. He wants to do something like that at the same time. So that complicates, obviously, for Ukrainian interests, because they might be compromised somewhat in the peace deal in order to get this. This is the reality of what his goals are, I think, his geopolitical goals.
To be honest, Mr. Donald, I don't think that a lot of Ukrainians awaits something from what's going to happen in Alaska, because until there is no Ukrainian president with them, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine,
Right.
I don't see any possible deal. And one of the conditions saying the land exchange, but we don't have any Russian land to exchange, we don't have any claim on Russian land, which is, basically very ironic.
He's talking about exchanges within Ukraine, obviously.
Yeah, within Ukraine, of course.
We know what he's talking about. This would be very difficult for Ukraine. I don't know. It's for the Ukrainian people to decide, Ukrainian president, Ukrainian people to decide these things. It could be very well could be that this is presented to Ukraine by Trump. That would be very difficult. And I would agree with you. I'm very skeptical how far Putin is willing to go, if he's willing to go far enough even to please Trump on these matters. It may be that if he comes there and he doesn't talk seriously, okay, that's enough of it, and we're back to the war and as it was, and back to this oil war. And this oil war, I think if Putin tries to play Trump again, I think this time Trump already looked very serious about going after India, and I think going after China. It's quite likely. Not only his reputation, but we know that Trump feels, and probably Biden had similarly, to be honest, that the main enemy, or what should I say, the main threat for the United States is China. And they want to manage Russia in a way, because this is something that only Americans can really deal with. The Europeans aren't going to help very much with this. Okay. And anyway, I lost my train of thought there, but this is what's also going on in these meetings in Alaska with Trump.
Yeah, and absolutely agree with you. And the goal of a Russian dictator not changing at all. It's not about only land. It's about erasing Ukrainian nationality, Ukrainians. I agree. Everything.
I completely agree. Now, let me say, it's like I'm describing a chess game. I'm not saying I'm favoring this, okay? But just as an analyst, I want to tell you, from Trump's point of view, or maybe from any other American's point of view, they want to get this war ended, because if they can't end this war in Europe with Russia, what credibility does Trump have down the line trying to make threats to China or dealing with China? So he really has to he really has to come out here somehow, the big man, somehow showing China that he was able to take care of this front, and now he can focus on China. That's one thing. The other thing, I think the United States could, if they wanted to, they could arm Ukraine. In principle, they could put American forces to train Ukraine. They could do a lot of things to really help Ukraine win the war. Now, strategically speaking, if Putin is embarrassed in Ukraine, if he's really defeated, what I think Trump worries about is then Putin is in a position where he abjectly gives in to the Chinese, and the Chinese have 1/3 of all the manufacturing capacity in the world. It's huge. They could really rearm Russia. So I'm not saying I approve of it, but I see what Trump is. He's got a delicate, he's on like a knife's edge balance. He wants to end the war, but in a way that at least pulls Putin slightly closer to the West, away from China. On the other hand, he can end the war in a way that makes it very difficult for Putin, and then he goes wholeheartedly with China, or he's forced to go with China, but he gets rearmed by China, and China can make Russia its cat's paw, allow them to attack everybody on the periphery in coming years, and make things simpler for China. So I think from Trump's point of view, and probably Biden's point of view before this, although they might have handled it differently, they have this delicate balance how to deal with Russia.
Yes, Mr. Donald, that's a very interesting thought. I've heard it before, but it's not that common. But I mean, okay, we'll see. We'll see. That's interesting. I really thank you so much for your time and your sharp mind, ideas, and I hope to see you again in our studio.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!